Chill out. Okay, let's do this. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. Go ahead, open up your notes. We're going to be continuing on with notes. These are going to be very helpful for you as you go into episode number 16, Détente, okay, which is well applied. Basically, think of this as being the Nixon years, okay? The Nixon years during the Cold War, and a little bit of Ford. We'll be covering some things that occurred during Nixon, including, write this down, the end of the Vietnam War, which we hinted at last and previously, talking about the Vietnam War and how things weren't going so well in 1968, and the country's public opinion was beginning to turn more and more decisively against a long-term U.S. engagement in the Vietnam War. Okay? So, we will be looking at that, Détente, 1969 to 1975. If you have that in front of you, Henry Kissinger, Kent State, Nguyen Van Thieu, Fall of Saigon, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Helsinki Treaty. Those are some of the key terms, and we'll be giving you additional terms as well. Oh, looks like I'm going to have to spell some out for you as well. No worries. You'll watch the video at home. Okay? Next time you guys come in here is Election Day. The next time I see you, it's going to be Election Day. Tuesday. If you get them in on Tuesday, that's fine. Because we won't start getting results back until the evening. Oh my gosh, no, this is worth potentially up to 10 points. That's how you do it. Yes, start doing some research. Yes, Sage. It's very interesting. Every state is in charge of its own voting laws. And of course, this year is quite different because of all of the concern and health issues and so forth. I'll just talk about Idaho. Idaho has had mail-in opportunities for a long time. It's the absentee ballot. And you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to be a certain age or whatever. You just like, hey, for convenience sake, I want it. So Idaho's rules that we have, you have to have it filled out by a certain date so that it will arrive by Election Day. Okay? So the due date for the mail-in is, I don't know, I think might have already passed. I'm guessing it's already passed, okay, or barely passed. So because in Idaho, they like to be able to add up all the votes on Election Day so we can get a result, okay? Other states have been adopting newer rules and things, and some of them have been sticking to old rules, and if somebody feels like that's not really fair, then they bring a lawsuit. And so the courts have been having to deal with all kinds of different things from various different states. So I can't even keep track of all the various different kinds of things going on there. It is, I dare say, as far as some states, we won't know some of the states. It's going to be like, I'll have until January to figure out exactly how many points you get on your extra credit thing, because there's always going to be some states that are going to be close. No. Do you know when this semester ends? In January. Yes, we started late. Did you notice that? Yeah, and you'll have some exams and things like in January after we come back. So I'll be following that very closely and giving you credit and so forth. If it's a blowout one way or another, and the only blowout I've heard even sort of contemplated is a Biden blowout. Most of the other scenarios are a Biden close win or a Trump close win. If it's either a close win, then we won't know. I'm sure when we get together, like after Election Day, it'll be on the Thursday the 5th. We'll still be talking about Pennsylvania or Florida or Ohio or Texas. I just read Texas. They've got more people that have voted in Texas already than have ever voted in a presidential election year. So there have been a lot of people who have been turning out for early voting, as well as they can vote on Election Day. Not, if you voted once, you can't vote twice. I mean, that's illegal, but, the opportunity is still there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yesterday I got a discussion with my friends, and they told me that there are no Romans who get laws in Idaho.
That's not true. You can look it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
we have them.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. So in other words, if somebody has intimate relations and they're, I think, 16 and the person's 17 or 18, that's not a violation of the law. If the person's 16 and the other person's like, 20, 21, 22, that's a violation of the law.
Isn't there like kids getting together for a certain amount of time though, where it's like that doesn't apply?
They try to make bright line rules, right, so that people can look and understand exactly what the rule is. Then there's the getting off topic here. Then there's the prosecutor's consideration. When I was a prosecutor, we'd look at something and go, okay, if we present this to a jury, how's this going to play out? So sometimes, ultimately, the prosecutor, if they're given a clear case, they're like, okay, we're going to have to do that, and they know that they might not win it, because would a jury convict somebody who'd been dating for 3 years, and here's one of them 16 and the other is 19? Maybe not, But it's a violation of the law, and yes, we do have Romeo and Juliet law. So-called, yeah. So anyway, get your predictions in. I'm real curious to see how that's going to play out. I'm sure we'll be talking about that as we go forward. But yeah, all kinds of various different interesting things taking place. I tell you what, it's not like the election of 1972. In 1972, write it down. Nixon won a huge, huge victory. Not everyone saw that coming in the year or more before the election of November 1972. But Nixon carried every single state except for Massachusetts and then the District of Columbia. It was a landslide. And as we go through the notes today, you're going to see that Nixon is going to be credited with a lot of foreign policy victories. A lot of things where people will look and go, wow, you're doing pretty well from our perspective of handling this very difficult Cold War mess and the effort to get us out of Vietnam. Having said that, it probably helped Nixon that his opponents, the Democrats, were in a bit of chaos, and they ended up having as their nominee somebody who was probably more left of where the country was, as in like politically left. Okay? So, you guys ready to dive on into the details here? All right. Oh, by the way, Friday is parent-teacher conferences. Those are getting set up via Zoom. Pretty much, the message has gone out. If you're not doing so well, like you're getting a D or an F, those are the conferences, the Zoom conferences that are being set up first and foremost. Okay, because I know in the past, as a teacher, I'd ended up talking to a lot of parents of kids who were actually doing quite well. It was an opportunity to have a nice visit, and we could see lots of people in the cafeteria, and yeah, but it's a little bit different this year. So if you're in that situation where you're not doing so well in a particular class, make sure that you make arrangements, your parents, to have a Zoom conference with that teacher or teachers. Make sense? Other questions? Okay. All right, let's get to it. 1969, the new president is Richard M. Nixon. Let's just say this quite clearly about Richard M. Nixon. He's been around, okay? He was the vice president, although how much power do you have as the vice president? When he was vice president under Eisenhower, you don't got a lot of power as vice president. Now he is the chief executive. And he knows a thing or two about foreign policy, and he's got some ideas about foreign policy. And, do I have this? Let me see if I get the guy up here. There we go. His top foreign policy person is Henry Kissinger. Write his name down. Henry Kissinger. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. You hear some in the current administration, Trump, distrusting people who've been in Washington, regulars of the United States government, as being kind of part of the swamp and so forth. That's not a new thing. We've had other presidents who come into Washington, D.C., and they're like, okay, I'm going to have to deal with a lot of people who are like permanent career employees of various different departments. Write this down. Nixon did not have complete trust in the State Department. Write that down. So even though he had a Secretary of State, Nixon did probably most of his really important diplomatic work through the National Security Agency. And the guy heading that up, the National Security Advisor, is Henry Kissinger. So write that down. Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor. He's in charge of a much smaller staff. I mean, the State Department has got running embassies in, let me see, how many different countries of the world? Looking over at my wall, like nearly almost 200. And we got embassies, and we got consulates, and the State Department's got all kinds of various different things. And most of the people in it are regular career employees. Nixon, write this down, hang on just a sec. Nixon did not trust them to follow what he wanted to do, and, get this, he didn't trust them to keep their mouth shut if he was trying to pull off some top secret negotiations. Do you understand? We'll see that later on. When Nixon opens up relations and visits China, communist China, that's a big deal. That was a big surprise to people and was accomplished through, not the State Department so much, but Kissinger, his top foreign policy person who held the position as National Security Advisor. Yeah. An embassy is like an official U.S. Location in a foreign country, and they have theirs in our country as well. So we'll have an ambassador working there. It serves a number of purposes. For a tourist, you know, if you're an American tourist and you lose your passport, you go to the embassy and get another, thing there. If bad things start happening in that country, you go to the embassy as for safety. Because supposedly, we'll see this is going to be a problem during Reagan's administration, during Carter's administration, the United States Embassy in Iran is supposed to be like hands off. Nobody should touch it. The Iranian government is going to allow our entire embassy personnel to be held captive. That's a real big no-no. Oh yeah, trust me, we'll spend plenty of time on that one. That's going to be like messed up. Okay? So that's why, through embassies, that's where you can have some of the official communications. So for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who was the main Soviet person to communicate with the U.S. government? The Soviet ambassador to the United States. So he worked in Washington, D.C. at the Soviet embassy, right? Anatoly Dobrynin, you've got him in your notes previously. And he was talking to, who was Kennedy's top trusted advisor to deal with foreign policy? Bobby Kennedy, his brother, who was in charge of, the Justice Department. That's kind of weird there, but it's the person who you trust. Nixon trusts Kissinger. They're very, 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 very close, okay? And Kissinger, very bright, and Nixon, very bright on these things. It's almost like they could play 3 or 4 level chess or something like that. They would sort of look and see if we do this and they do that and we do this and they do that and so forth. It's very, very complex, Possibly among the presidents, certainly on the lower ranked here, I would put Nixon right up there as far as having the most grasp of it. Now, people would criticize some of his policies. And you can put this down. Nixon wanted us out of Vietnam. Write it down. I think we mentioned that last time. He wanted the United States to be able to get out of Vietnam. But he didn't want to have a clear loss. And this is the tricky thing that he was trying to balance. Because the more the country turned against the U.S. participation in the war, the more Congress, right, which is responsible for funding and approving troops and money to be spent in the war, the more Congress turned against it. So less support for the Vietnam War, lots of protests in various different campuses. Right? You have Kent State. That was a campus that had a lot of protests going on there. Huge student protests. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Nixon, his policy of getting out of the war is called Vietnamization. Vietnamization. I think I covered that before, did I? I remember saying it to at least one of the classes. Nobody? All right. Vietnamization is Nixon's policy to basically hand over the responsibility of fighting the war to the South Vietnamese, exactly. As he entered the White House, Nixon in 1969, we had, what, over 550,000 U.S. troops there. And they were carrying on most of the bulk of the responsibility as far as fighting. They had the equipment, they had the president, Johnson was like getting in there and so forth. And we'll continue doing that, but, write this down, Nixon is going to reduce the United States military ground troops. Yes?
So, this isn't like a very probably interesting thing, but like, I don't understand why Vietnam is really like something how like it was the United States versus like a third world country. Like I don't understand how they
And they were doing quite well.
yeah, I don't get why it's so challenging for us to compete in a third world country.
Well,
When we
I'll put the question back to you. We've got more resources to beat them, right?
yeah.
In fact, we could just blow them to kingdom come, right? So why didn't we? Why didn't we just like blow the North Vietnamese command centers and just totally nuke Hanoi? What other issues? Be specific. Really? Well, what might that lead to? Yeah. Yeah. See, that's the thing. That was the real concern. Johnson was aware of that. Truman and Eisenhower were aware of that during the Korean War. I mean, that was why Truman fired General MacArthur, who wanted to take U.S. troops over across the Yalu River into communist China because the communist Chinese were supplying, and then ultimately they jumped into the war. That's always the tricky thing about fighting these kinds of wars in the midst of a larger Cold War. The Soviets, the United States, the Chinese never were really interested in it becoming a full-on global nuclear war because that would have just been terrible. And so, who had their hand tied behind their back during the Vietnam War? We do. Okay? Because if we had actually hit the suppliers of the North Vietnamese, we would have hit communist China, and they had nukes. We would have hit the Soviet Union, and they had nukes. Does that make sense? It's tough. Yeah, I mean, American public opinion, you don't have to go very far to find somebody who would say, let's just turn the whole place into a parking lot. We can do that. Why are we getting bloodied in this long war when we can actually do? If we try to fight like a traditional, conventional war and go in and kill the enemy where they are, here was the problem. We saw this before. How do you know who the enemy is if you go into a Vietnamese village that's being, you're getting fired upon? You don't. There you go. That's one way, I suppose. I mean, yeah, it's not very good. Here is something that Nixon will employ. Ready? Write this down. Because he really does want to, he doesn't want to just walk away from the war. He wants to pass along the responsibility to the South Vietnamese, but he doesn't want to lose it. He wants to basically, write this down, he wants to bomb the enemy to the negotiating table to get good terms. Got that? Because unless you get good terms, as good a terms of a peace agreement as possible, then it's like you quit and you walk away. You lose. Nixon doesn't want to be a loser. Johnson didn't want to be a loser. They wanted to get something that looks like a victory and call it done so we can bring all of our troops home. Because we are in a very difficult situation in our country. We have it kind of reminds me a bit of our country today. We got protests and people are very angry and you get violence, you get rioting, you get really strongly held opinions. That was going on in 68, in 69, in 70, in 71. Kent State occurred in May of 1970. Write this down. This is in Ohio. Protests were going on at various different campuses, mostly anti-war protests, but Nixon actually would say, there's a silent majority. Oh, it's always fascinating to hear about the silent majority. The people who watch what's going on and go, they disapprove, but they don't necessarily join in counter-protests. They support the country. They support U.S. involvement, but they don't show up in the counter-protests. So Nixon was sort of looking and saying, oh, these student protests are just sort of an aberration. It'll be really interesting. We'll have this conversation perhaps next week. The polls say who is likely to win the presidential election? Biden. And then there's this question of the silent Trump voters. How many silent Trump voters are there? 4 years ago, the polls seemed to suggest that Hillary Clinton was going to win. But then the actual results of the election showed that Trump ended up winning. The so-called silent Trump voters, people who were in favor of Trump but wouldn't necessarily want to say so publicly because of any social problems and so forth that might have. So, we'll see if that is the case. Was there a silent majority that supported Nixon? I don't know. It's an interesting question because on campuses, write this down, there were huge protests. And things were getting kind of crazy. At Kent State, people are like, oh, well, 4 students got shot and killed. You can write that down. 4 dead in Ohio. When I have more time, I play the Neil Young song. Right? 4 dead in Ohio. It's an anti-war song talking about what's going on there. It's very good. Neil Young's a very good guitarist and so forth. Sorry, Jacob, I didn't include that. Maybe I'll put the link in there. Okay? So, yeah, because, has that ever happened before? Musical artists getting involved in the politics of a country, singing Revolution. Yeah, in the 1960s, most of the music that came out, certainly the popular music, the rock music, had an anti-war tinge to it. Yeah.
Why do they protest back in so much more Christianity universities?
Well, I'll put you the question. Why do you think so? Let me ask you this question. Who is going to go fight in the war? Old people, young people? Young people. That's part of it, yeah. So of course, if you're on a college campus, the irony is if you're on a college campus in those days, you're not draft eligible. As long as you can stay in college, you're not going to be drafted to go into the war. There's no draft. So that's not even an issue. There's just no draft. You have to register, that's it. Boys have to register. Men, 18. When you turn 18, males, you have to register. If we ever do bring back a draft, I've actually, kicked that around, and more I'm seeing people going, yeah, make the girls sign up too. Equality, there you go. So anyway, who knows? But there was a lot of strong feeling, and a lot of strong feeling about the war and people that they knew, and so, not everyone, but there was quite a bit. One of the things that was happening at Kent State, for your information, is there was actually some arson going on. I think there was like a ROTC, because a lot of campuses had Reserve Officers Training Corps, because basically somebody could go to college, be in the military, reserve, ROTC, and then finish their college and go into the military for a while. And then what's the benefit of that to the student? They get their college paid for. But the ROTC, I want to say the ROTC building in Kent State got attacked, burned down, perhaps, I think. So anyway, the governor of Ohio was like, well, we need to send in the National Guard for security. So you have all these young National Guardsmen marching around Kent State, and you got tons and tons of students moving this way, that way, and so forth. Here was the biggest mistake. The young National Guardsmen had live ammunition in their weapons. So they didn't necessarily have a full complement of crowd control things short of live ammunition. And they fired off live ammunition at one point in time, and 4 people were killed and others were injured. Okay? That was a low point in that situation. Enough pressure is going to be put upon Nixon. Oh, but here, and one of the things they were protesting, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. One of the things they were protesting, because this was a new thing, it wasn't just the United States, because the United States was pulling troops out. And yet, there was one complement of our military that was very engaged in it. Write this down. Our bombing campaign. We had increased bombing of targets of interest. Let me see if I don't have to go back too far to get to that. Yeah, here we go. We were bombing North Vietnam. And of course, we've been bombing North Vietnam, under the Johnson years. Increasingly, write this down, we had a secret bombing campaign of Cambodia. Write that down. We increased, during Nixon's time, we increased the amount of bombing we were doing in Cambodia. Now, you can look at the map here and understand clearly why we were doing that. Why were we bombing Cambodia, Daniel? It's not even where the war is officially supposed to be taking place. Why are we bombing Cambodia? What line? The supply lines, yeah. What was the supply line called? Ho Chi Minh Trail, yeah. So there was a lot of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supplies and troops and so forth going through Cambodia, so that's why we bombed it. But that's not so, it doesn't look so good because Cambodia is officially a neutral country. So anyway, some of the protests at the college campuses and so forth were related to the so-called secret war of the United States, where we were bombing not only in Cambodia but also in Laos as well, okay? Because we wanted to make sure that we had that we reduce their capacity, okay? Meanwhile, we have Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, who is interested in broaching the United States with what is called détente. All right, let's get into détente. It's the name of the film, and it's the name of the policy that's going to be developed between the United States and the Soviet Union during the time of Brezhnev and Nixon, and it will continue on beyond Nixon's time into the mid-late 1970s. Okay, so that's kind of where things are going to be as we wrap up this particular phase of the Cold War. It will be broken off when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. You're like, wait a minute, I thought we invaded Afghanistan. Everybody invades Afghanistan at one point in time in history. Here's what détente is. All right, you ready? It's French. Basically means a relaxation of tensions. Okay? Let's see if we can kind of ease things up a little bit. What? It's like the French, they've got all these great words. I mean, France is still officially like the diplomatic language upon which at least one copy of all treaties are done. It's like the official diplomatic language. So, détente. Okay? Yeah. Détente. Yeah. So, certain places it'll be a little bit easier to carry that out than others. Write this down. East and West Germany. East and West Germany. Let me give you the name of the new West German Chancellor. He showed up earlier in your studies. His name is Willy Brandt. And it's not spelled right there, but W-I-L-L-I-E, and then Brandt, B-R-A-N-D-T. Brandt. I know I don't have it there, but I think I've got it in a previous one for the Berlin Wall. Yep, there we go. Berlin Wall, episode number 9, Willy Brandt. He started out politics as the mayor of West Berlin. He will then, in the early 1970s, become the chancellor of West Germany. Okay? Politically, not that it matters as much, but he is left of center, mainline political party in West Germany. Okay? And he wants to have better relations with East Germany. I mean, you don't have the Berlin crisis anymore, right? The Berlin Wall's up, and it's like, what more can you do? So here's what Willy Brandt does, and he's starting to sort of like set the tone here. He visits East Germany, and he visits Moscow. He visits the Soviet Union. And he says, I will recognize the boundaries as they now exist at the end of World War II. So he's basically saying, okay, yeah, there's an East Germany, and yeah, there's a Poland, and whatever those boundaries are that were created, I guess we're cool with that, okay? Because he wants there to be less tension. He is very interested because with a relaxation of tension, then you can have better things for, like, I don't know, average people, for example. One of the things that average people that living in East and West Germany want is to be able to maybe see their families that have been separated. And so there's going to be a little bit more of that. You got that? I mean, that's a real thing, particularly families like in separated East and West Berlin. Okay? So they actually have a name for it. Ostpolitik. Ostpolitik. Sometimes you hear these various different words. Politik, basically politics. The way that the Germans would say politics. What do you suppose Ost means? Anybody idea? O-S-T. Ostpolitik. East. Yeah. So let's have politics. Let's have better relations with the East. So says Willy Brandt. The United States is like, hey, are you supposed to be in charge of setting foreign policy for the Cold War? yes, you may be living closer to the East Germans and the Soviets and so forth, but Nixon soon will be stepping in and taking more of the charge as far as what is going to be the official relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, sometimes you see things starting to play out on the ground. Okay? Let me just say this. Let's go back to this good cop, bad cop thing. I like getting back to this relationship between Nixon and Kissinger. In fact, we're going to be talking about them quite a bit from here on out. Nixon's the president. He knows foreign policy. Oh, by the way, is he an anti-communist or is he pro-communist? He's very anti-communist. Nixon, hello. When did Nixon get his start in politics? What was one of the first big issues that sort of helped him to make his name in politics as a young former veteran, rookie congressman? Nixon? No, those are Soviet posters. Yeah, I had to take one down because it didn't. Yeah. Oh, and also, yeah. Anyway, you're fine because it's like I didn't leave the one poster right where Jack is sitting now because I didn't want it to get damaged. So, because we're creating more separation and so forth in here. What's that? Yeah, they're real Soviet posters. So they're like collectors. They don't make them anymore. Okay? So you're like, ooh, I'm going to break in. Yeah, exactly. So speaking of, Nixon is Mr. Anti-Communist. And it's very interesting because as we go through this, more people have a lot more trust in Nixon. So I've got this kind of goofy comment here. Who can negotiate with the Klingons? Klingon folk Captain Kirk can. You're like, what the heck? What does Star Trek have to do with any? Star Trek is cultural history. Star Trek was on television in the late 1960s. I had a student do, I can't remember if it was an IA or an EE, on a history topic about the cultural impact of the first interracial television kiss between Captain Kirk and who else knows? Who was the member of the crew who was African American? Lieutenant Uhura. Yes, anyway, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. And of course that was going in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. Well, in here, the number one enemy of the Federation are the Klingons. And Kirk hates the Klingons. So who do you trust to be a good negotiator with the other side? The one that hates you. That's where Nixon is given a lot of trust. Write it down. More people in the United States feel perhaps they can trust Nixon to negotiate with the Chinese communists or the Soviet communists because he's anti-communist. He's never going to give up the whole gang. That's the thinking. That's why throughout the Cold War you so often get both sides actually accusing the other side of being soft on communism. We've heard this refrain right from the get-go. Remember, who was this senator from Wisconsin who was like Mr. Anti-Communist and said he had a list of a whole bunch of communists, and he didn't actually have a list, but he accused people of potentially being communist. McCarthy, Joe McCarthy. Okay? That's McCarthyism, exactly. Yeah, that idea of like, were there communist spies? Yeah, there were. Actually, there were. And this was a big deal. And so here's Nixon. Who can negotiate with the communists? Nixon. So he's going to be the top negotiator with Henry Kissinger. They're going to bounce ideas off each other, and they literally will play this good cop, bad cop thing. Where Kissinger, oftentimes, write this down, Kissinger is going to be the one who's going to be in the face-to-face negotiations with the North Vietnamese negotiators. Got that? Write this down. You're going to have the North Vietnamese. This is going to be taking place primarily in Paris, where Kissinger is going to be like talking to the top North Vietnamese negotiator and saying, basically the good cop approach. You understand the good cop, bad cop? Okay. I should have queued it up. It is a very funny video of the good cop, bad cop. Steve Martin does the good cop, bad cop in Inspector Clouseau, the Pink Panther. Have you seen the Pink Panther with Steve Martin? Where he actually tries to play both the good cop and the bad cop, which is really stupid. The good cop is like, I'm going to be very nice to you to try and get whoever to cooperate. And then, of course, the bad cop is the one who does really bad things. And the good cop says, you should cooperate with me because if you don't cooperate with me and help me out and so forth, I'm going to do everything I can to help you out. That bad cop is going to do some really terrible things. Well, what does that have to do with the United States government? Kissinger would say, knowing exactly what he was saying, and Nixon knew exactly what he was saying too. He would say to the North Vietnamese, you need to be willing to reach a peace agreement with us, because if you don't, Nixon, he's just like, he'll get angry. And what can a president of the United States do if they're getting very upset and angry with you? Bomb, exactly. And that's what they would do. Kissinger would say, to the North Vietnamese negotiator, you need to be able to reach a peace agreement with us. Otherwise, you're just going to get more and more and more bombing because I can't control Nixon. He's the boss. He's the president. Do you follow that? Okay? It's a tactic that they used. And, of course, the North Vietnamese are looking and going, hey, we can play this too. I've looked at your public opinion in America, and it seems to be declining in support for continuation of U.S. Involvement in the Vietnam War, and particularly on bombing. Yeah. I meant North Vietnam. Sorry. Yeah, North Vietnam. I always get those ones mixed up. Yeah. Yeah, we weren't fighting in North Korea at that point in time. That had been kind of like laid down. So here we go. One of the things that the United States did to try and put some pressure on the Soviets, because the Soviets, make sure you have this, and we've mentioned this before, which was North Vietnam's most supportive ally? Was it the Soviets or was it the Chinese? It was the Soviets. Write that down. It was the Soviets. And as things went on, the tension between the Soviets and the Chinese actually had been increasing. And Nixon was aware of this. And so he wants to create some pressure on one and the other. He turns what had been, U.S. on our side in a face-to-face thing with the communists, he turns it into a three-part deal. You're like, what are you talking about? If you were to look at the border troops, there were more border troops along the Soviet and Chinese border at various different times in the Cold War, and certainly during that time period, than in any other, than in many of the other ones. There was actual real tension between the Chinese and the Soviets. So what Nixon did, is he tried to, and did, write it down, opened up relations with communist China. This is a huge, huge thing. And this was all done very secretively. Kissinger working with the top Chinese communists. Of course, the Chinese communists hated the United States from the time of the Korean War, even before then. But Mao, the leader of communist China, Mao looks and he's like, hey, wait, we're getting a lot of hassle from the Soviet Union, so maybe if we open up some good relations with the United States, that can put some pressure off of the Soviets. Do you understand that? February 21st to February 28th, 1972, Nixon flew to China. This was a huge event. People around the world are like, whoa! President of the United States is going to a communist country? We didn't have embassies between the two countries. At that point, we hadn't recognized the Chinese Communist government as the government of most of China. What did we still say was the official government of China? The Republic of China. And what was the only piece of territory that the Republic of China had control of by that time in history? Give you a clue. It starts with a T and it rhymes with Iwan. Taiwan. Very good. Yes. So we had been backing up and giving support to Taiwan, including the status of we officially recognize you and have embassy relations and so forth. But Nixon realizes the reality. Communist China ain't going anywhere. And of course, Mao is trying to put some pressure against the Soviets. So they have the meeting. And they begin the process of unfreezing the relations with the United States and Communist China. Within a few years, the United States and Communist China will have official embassies and much closer relations and so forth. Okay? That was a big deal. And of course, that did put pressure on North Vietnam, and it did put pressure on the Soviets. And what did we get out of that? Well, Nixon was able to arrange another big, important foreign visit. Write this down, May 22nd, 1972. So within the space of a few months, Nixon not only goes to China, now he goes to Moscow to have a meeting with Brezhnev. And Nixon gets his homework done, at least Kissinger and the people around him. They have the homework done already. When he shows up there, it's not like they're just going to sit around and go, well, what do you think? What should we do? They already have a treaty ready to sign. We talked about this before. The SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, has been wrapped up, and they will have a limitation on nuclear weapons right there for the president to sign. This isn't 72. Nixon's running for re-election. He opens up relations with China. He has a big summit with the Soviets in 72. It's no wonder the guy ended up winning a big election victory in 1972. And by the way, when they had that meeting, the Soviets were like, they set aside, you'll hear this in the video, it's fascinating. They set aside like about, 10 minutes or so, just to, maybe a little bit longer, just to rail into the United States about how terrible and bombing the Cambodia and the North Vietnamese and so forth. But they wouldn't let that difference over the Vietnam War get in the way of other relations and things that they wanted to look at for the entire planet. Okay? There you go. What could possibly go wrong for President Nixon as he's having these big, huge foreign policy victories leading ultimately to a success in the presidential election? I mean, it's not like he's going to make an unforced error. You know what that means? Unforced error like in baseball or something? We just make some stupid mistake and it's like that they didn't even do anything. What was the unforced error that Nixon did in 1972? Excuse me, that people associated with Richard Nixon did in 72. Watergate, the break into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and the cover-up that followed right thereafter. Meanwhile, boom, write this down, Kissinger is able to make the deal in France with the North Vietnamese. This was actually signed January 23rd, 1973, so right after Nixon took his oath of office for a second term. This is going to be called Peace with Honor. That's what we call Peace with Honor. What is the United States going to agree to as far as the Vietnam conflict? We're going to remove our troops. What did the North Vietnamese agree to? They're going to stop fighting. Did South Vietnam, President Nguyen Van Thieu, did he like this deal? No. Because why didn't he like the deal? Because the U.S. pulled the troops out. Now, we did promise to the South Vietnamese that if the North Vietnamese violated the treaty, we would bring the troops back in. And they did. They violated the treaty. They attacked in 1975. President Ford at that time, because Nixon had resigned as a result of Watergate, President Ford was like, I'm going to get in there and I'll send the troops, but Congress would not fund it. Congress is going to have nothing to do with it. So what did the North Vietnamese do? They took over. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls on April 30th, 1975. It falls. I remember going to the Ford Museum, and that curator did a really cool job because he had all kinds of stuff that was in the museum that was related to the presidency of Ford. They had the staircase that was on the top of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They brought that to Grand Rapids, Michigan. The staircase where the last U.S. military embassy personnel got on the last helicopter to fly away after the communists took over. Yeah, it's messed up. There's just a little bit more notes that we're going to do on that one, so I might hold off, I suppose, on officially requiring that. It's okay. And then we're going to get into spies. We got some really cool stuff on spies next time. So, right, that's where we are.